Today's episode is brought to you with the welcome support of Malbin Greek, UK's leading Greek delicatessen supplier and distributor of premium Greek produce. Whatever your needs, Malbin Greek has you covered. You can shop online and have the divine and delicious goods delivered to your doorstep across the UK, or you can visit the shop at Arch 17 Apollo Business Park, Lucy Way, SC16 4ET, Bermondsey, London. Malbin Greek, the one-stop shop for your Greek fix.
Hello there, sorry to interrupt. My name's Dr. Neil Buttery and I'm host of the British Food History Podcast, a podcast that you, as a fan of the delicious legacy, might be interested in. I explore British food and its history in all its glory, with interviews with special guests, recipes, reenactments, and tracking down forgotten recipes and hyper-regional specialities. Previous topics include medieval eels, 18th century dining, curry, London street food sellers, breakfast, and the good old Yorkshire pudding. Search for the British Food History Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And now, back to the delicious legacy. Cheers!
Leaving Great Rome for Aricia, a Modestine received me. The rhetorician Heliodorus was with me, most learned of Greeks. To Forum Appiae, then, crammed with bargemen and stingy innkeepers. We took this lazily, in 2 days, though keener travellers than us take only one. The Appians easier taken slow. Here, because of the lousy water, my stomach declares war on me, and I wait impatiently while the others dine. Night's already beginning to shroud the earth in shadow, and sprinkle the heavens with stars. On straight to Beneventum, where our busy host nearly burned the inn, turning lean thrushes over the fire. As Vulcan's fumes dispersed through the ancient kitchen, darting flames licked right up the roof of overhead. You saw scared servants and famished guests snatch food, and everyone tried to extinguish the roaring blaze. From that point on, Apulia begins to reveal her familiar hills to me, scorched by Sirocco. From here, we rushed on in a cart 24 miles to spend the night in a little town I can't fit in the fares. Though here's a clue. They sell what's commonly free. There, water. But the bread's the best by far. So wise travellers carry a load on their shoulders for later. These are the words of Horace, or Quintus Horatius Flaccus, a leading Roman lyric poet in the time of Octavian. And this is from the poem The Satires, and paints a rather interesting picture of the urban world of ancient Rome, with the inns, the taverns, and the travelling between Rome and the different towns of the Italian peninsula. Hello. This is the Delicious Legacy Podcast. Welcome back to another archeogastronomical adventure. I'm your host, Thomas Dinas, and today we'll travel back to 2000 years ago to the ancient Roman world. I've realized that I've done so many episodes about ancient food, ancient Mediterranean food, about Greece and Rome, but I've realized I haven't delved into the everyday foods of the citizens of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. And mainly I focused in recipes of the rich and the luxurious Romans, which is kind of understandable since that's where we get most of our information from, and our sources talk about the foods that the rich patricians and the knights and the emperors and the senators and what have you. Of course, the reality for most people in most of the empire or the republic earlier on, it was quite different. And thinking about that, I was also thinking about the highly urbanized life and lifestyle of the Romans. Most of the Roman citizens and most of the Roman activity, commercial or otherwise, was happening in urban centers across the Mediterranean and further afield. So how did these people survive on a day-to-day basis? What was their food and how the empire fed them? After all, feeding 50 to 75 million people, which was the population of the Roman Empire at its height, was no mean feat. And this is the center, the epicenter of what we call the Mediterranean diet, of course. We have olive oil and olives, grapes, wine, broad beans, peas, lentils, cheese, onions, and of course dates and almonds and pine nuts, cumin, coriander, sesame, mint. All of this stuff were used and were eaten on a daily basis. The book of Apicius gives us a little glimpse of the daily food items that some people ate. But of course, it was the people who could afford slaves as cooks or hire cooks to create for them some exotic dishes as such. So Romanites, businessmen and traders of all kinds, landowners, skilled craftsmen, and so on. When we think of the Roman Empire, aside from Rome, which had a population of anything between 250,000 to a million people in its height, and that was basically unsurpassed until the 19th century London. Never any other city in Europe had such a high population. There were other big urban centers across the Italian peninsula, firstly, but also the empire as a whole. So if you think places like Neapolis, modern day Napoli, Capua, Crotone, Messini, Syracuse, Mediolano, modern Milano, all these places were big urban centers. But even places like Pompeii and Herculaneum, with population between 15,000 people or so, these places were highly urbanized, with people living in close quarter with each other, and slaves and traders and so on, all having to be fed constantly and on the go. So let's go and explore some ancient Roman urban foods, kitchen, and the technology behind these elements. The day of the average Roman begins at dawn. That was without coffee. So I guess they had to get ready and dressed at considerable speed to go and do their jobs. There was not a such thing as washing and changing clothes, as that was happening later on at the baths. So the breakfast usually it's a scratch meal, the barest of minimum, I guess some water and a piece of bread. As I said, there was no coffee back then. Perhaps for some people there was cold leftovers from the night before. And generally, obviously, time is at a premium when one needs to do all the labor of the day and the social activities with the daylight. And of course, trying to avoid the heat of the afternoon if it's summertime. Here it's worth mentioning that the length of the Roman hour fluctuated according to the seasons. But usually the day's labor did not extend beyond 7 hours in the summer and probably around 6 in the winter. Obviously, all those people who were rich enough to have private income from the land and they didn't have to work as much, the whole afternoons were free. Going towards midday, lunch for the non-laboring classes was, as with breakfast, a very quick meal of leftovers, cheese, fruit, bread, generally items and ingredients that involve the minimum of cooking. The whole fine dining as such experience was confined to the evening meal. This was called the cena. We can assume that the laboring classes who needed to keep their energy levels up during the working day may well have consumed considerably greater volume of food at midday. So the proletariat of Rome, the traders, the craftsmen, the skilled laborers, retailers of all kinds, as well as the unskilled laboring masses, lived, as we said, in this urban sprawl in insula, which were flats constructed of wood above a stone and brick-built houses, and the businesses on the ground floor. Generally, these flats were 3 or 4 floors high, and the higher you lived, the poorer you were. the less likely you would be to have access to cooking facilities, of course. Let's not forget that wood catches fire quite easily, so having stoves or stuff like this back in the day, especially back in the day, was considerably dangerous, as well as very expensive, of course. So what was popular, what was happening, it was street food, or more precisely, fast food. That was the common thing in the diet of most working class people back then. We can imagine laborers walking through the narrow cobbled streets of Roman urban centers with hundreds of different smells wafting through the air and tingling the nostrils of hungry people. So they would buy things such as pasties made with an oil-based pastry filled with pulses or some roughly minced meat, meatballs. That was another very popular street food. Any kind of offal, as well as blood sausages, white sausages cooked with pulses, and simple patinae, which is the ancient Roman equivalent of our scrambled eggs or omelette or the Roman frittata of today. These omelettes were filled with any amount of meat, fish or vegetables that was available to the different trader, of course, to the different cook and the different stall. So there was all these potential lunch items available from the street vendors. And this, of course, you could also take home as well. And that was the lunch experience of the everyday Roman. As the day moves towards the time for dinner, the more leisured classes, and those now free from labor, headed to the baths. It was very important to have a bath. Women generally had been in their ablutions at midday. Wealthy men had private bathhouses, of course, in their own homes, or exclusive clubs which they could intermingle and socialize with each other. The laboring classes had access to large-scale public baths, of course. There were plenty of them, plenty of bath complexes around. In Rome, for example, you had the baths of Caracalla, or the Diocletian ones, where thousands could engage in the same basic cleaning and hygiene routine. This routine was exercise, socialize, bathe, get a massage, change your tunic, possibly shave and get a haircut, and then attempt to get a dinner invitation if you didn't already have one. Occasionally, there was also snacking or small delicacies, and ultimately, on your way home, wander to a lavish or more humble dinner. Attached to the baths, sometimes were restaurants and bars, and the party could easily spend the whole evening there. There is a bilingual phrase book called Daily Conversation for those who want to learn Latin and Greek, or Greek to Latin and Latin to Greek. So the imaginary speaker is heading a party of friends, and they're going for an evening of enjoyment in a tavern. In the book, then it tells us about what to order, how can you order for a wide variety of starters and main courses. And it talks about, for starters, give us beetroot or gourd, add some fish sauce to that. Give us radishes and a knife, and some lettuce and cucumber, with vinegar and fish sauce dressing. Bring us a trotter, a black pudding and a sow's womb. We'll all have white bread. The sauce wants more oil in it. Scale the plichards before you put them on the table. We'll have pork shoulder and ham and some mustard. Isn't the fish grilled yet? Now then, some slices of venison, wild boar, chicken, hare. Give everybody a portion of cabbage. Slice the boiled meat. Now serve the drinks. We've all had a drink. Bring the turtle doves and the pheasant. Bring the adder and some alec. Let's eat. It's just right. Give us the roast sucking pig. That's very hot. You'd better carve it. Bring honey in a jug. Bring a fatted goose and some pickles. Take round some water to rinse people's hands. Bring us yogurt, if you have any, with honey, and some halva. Cut it into slices and we can serve it out. That's a good meal. Give the waiters and the servants something to eat and drink. And also the cook, because he has served as well. Come on, let's go out for a walk. From this phrase book, we can see what could have been ordered in an ancient Roman restaurant, which is very fascinating, don't you think? So as we said, the cena was the main meal, the dinner, and the cena itself was a very formal meal with a set number of courses, usually 3. But the number of individual dishes within each course was almost, one could say, limitless. So the meal always started with a drink, which was either a honeyed wine, a mulsum, or a conditum. Mulsum was a mixture of wine and honey rather than mead, and a conditum, as we said before, was a spiced wine, generally using pepper, sometimes also dates and saffron. In ancient Rome, there was a phrase from eggs to nuts, which was the phrase for eating all these different dishes from starter to dessert. Eggs typically formed part of the gustatio, the first course, along with numerous small appetizers to stimulate the palate. A banquet menu recorded by Macrobius lists among many things for the hors d'oeuvres oyster patina, as we said, an omelette, oyster omelette, fish patina, and sow's udder patina, which suggests that the eggs served at the beginning of the meal could be quite elaborate, not just boiled eggs or just fried eggs or whatever. You could have all these different dishes. Salad, olives, bread, tuna, meatballs, which they were called isichia, shellfish of all kinds with dipping sauces, were all fair game for a gustatio course. Then we have the first tables, mensae primae, because the tables were brought in already laid, which comprised the impressive main courses. These, of course, were roasted joints of meat and poultry, whole stuffed piglet, lamb or kid goat, whole baked fish, more patinae, minutals, which are the stews, eels, hare, and the list is endless, basically. Yeah, there's an endless list of more elaborate and simple main course dishes. The best way to imagine a Roman banquet is to think it perhaps a little bit like a Chinese meal, perhaps, that there's a vast array of dishes served in bowls and platters, and the guest often had a small dish or a platter to eat from. So food moved from the large communal serving dish to individual dishes, and then was eaten with the fingers. Softer foods were eaten with spoons, and the guests could also have a knife to cut their own meat from the joint if there weren't any slave carvers present. Each person could have a relatively small amount of each item on his plate at any one time, and the process of consumption was slow and steady rather than a hurried meal, gobbling down and then moving next and da-da-da. I think we could learn a lot from that type of dinner, I think. The fact is that the meal itself could take many hours to complete. The position of the various items on the table seems to be very important, as is the position of the guest on the couch. We even hear of some less important guests, freedmen or hangers-on, at the lower end of the couch, failing to get the most desirable foods because they could not reach them. Bearing this in mind, a Roman meal simply is not meat and 2 veg. There should be at least 4 or 5 individual hors d'oeuvres served in separate bowls, with small dishes or plates for each guest to eat off, so that they can take from the communal dishes. And this is equally true, as we said, for the main course too. And the whole roast meat with its elaborate decoration would be carved into small pieces by a slave, so that each guest only picks up what he needs and dips the meat into the accompanying sauces, served in little bowls. Then we have the mensae secundae, which is the second tables, or what we can call a dessert, which comprises fairly simple items such as fruit, nuts, and sometimes honey cheesecakes. In the book of Apicius, there are some dessert recipes, and this has largely been explained by the fact that baked goods tended to be dealt in a separate literary form. As we said before, Apicius is a cook's collection of recipes rather than an actual cookbook, and this separation of sweet and savory doesn't necessarily apply there. How was the Roman kitchen? How did people cook all these different dishes, simple and elaborate ones? We catch a glimpse of the shabbiness of the ancient kitchen and its primitiveness in the writings of many different writers. There was rarely a supply of fresh water. Usually a bucket would have been fetched from a public fountain, and the lack of ventilation would have caused a smoky atmosphere. Classical writers such as Martial tells of a black kitchen. Horace moans about smoke from the kitchen causing ice to water, and Seneca often refers to the city of Rome as if it was a little more than an agglomeration of charcoal stoves. The kitchen fire could, when out of hand, threaten the whole house. Horace describes how, when dining out at Beneventum, the kitchen caught fire, causing guests and slaves to panic in their efforts to extinguish the blaze. The preparation of food centered on the knife and the pestle and mortar. Almost every archaeological site contains fragments of mortars, heavy clay bowls with a lip for pouring that often had grit baked in the bottom to facilitate grinding. As food was eaten at the table with fingers and bread, everything was either chopped into manageable chunks or pureed before serving. Spoons were the only pieces of cutlery that seemed to have been used regularly. Their handles, which had sharp pointed ends, are commonly thought to have been used for hooking snails out of their shells. On the other hand, virtually raw eggs heated quickly in boiling water were a popular delicacy, and pointed spoon handles may have been used to puncture the shell as well and allow the contents to be sucked out. Two-pronged forks certainly existed, and there is some fine examples of that in some archaeological museums, but their use at the table is not confined in the surviving literature. Double-handed blades were used for mincing, and a range of cooking pots and baking trays would have made a similar impression to us as one in a modern kitchen. Of course, the food can be roasted, boiled, fried, cooked on the grill, or craticulum. They had also the double boiler with inside vessel of wickerwork, the vatilum or batilum, a chafing dish with coals in the lower pan, cooking in the thermospodium or hot ashes, which corresponds to our fireless cooking or the method of the clam bake, and the cooking in carta or paper. The Roman fuels were wood and coal. Perhaps all this sounds a bit similar to our kitchens and to our cooking, which could lead to an impression that not much changed in the past 2,000 years, but really the use of cleaner and more efficient fuels and devices for us, and also the way of measuring heat more precisely, it's something that obviously we can think it's very different from a Roman oven or a Roman kitchen. Talking about ovens, two kinds of ovens are mentioned, the furnus and klibanus. There was utensils for cooking meat, the sardago, which is like our frying pan, the cortina or kettle, and the craticulum, like a piece of metal wickerwork. There are obviously cups like calyx and chiathus, a ladle, a dipper, a cup for vinegar, a small cask, mushroom dishes, pultarius for porridges, flat-shaped dishes for cooking and especially for serving, the patella, lanx and discus, and the mortar for grinding spices and other things, and sponges obviously for wiping tables and meats. Strainers for sieving, and knives, small knives like cultellus, molding boards, napkins and linen threads for sewing in stuffing. From the archaeological site of Pompeii, we have a surviving list of family shopping, which features bread, olive oil, wine and cheese, onions, dates and pear, but fish is only listed once, and there's no mention of meat. And this list was for food for just over a week shopping's worth, which is kind of interesting to see what people could afford to eat regularly. Bread was the main thing, obviously. Everybody had bread and ate bread made from wheat. But also there was barley, which was cheaper and generally made into porridge. From kitchens excavated in Pompeii, we get that the most recognizable feature is the masonry platform, sometimes edged with a low guard at the top. There were arched openings at the front of the platform, allowed for the storage of fuel. Stone supports for the wooden tables used for food preparation have also been discovered. Much of the cooking was carried out on small tripods and gridirons over burning charcoal. Many kitchens were probably unroofed, apart from canvas awnings that could be unfurled in bad weather, so that the smoke could escape easily. Bronze strainers with holes arranged in ornamental patterns were used to serve wine, although sieving was concerned less with catching the lees than the herbs and spices that were often added to improve or change the flavor of the wine. When the food was ready to serve, there was a variety of dishes to use: large platters and shallow bowls of silver, bronze and pewter, or fine pottery often decorated with incised patterns or designs in relief. From the 1st century BC, each course was brought into the dining room on a tray, generally made of wood, but sometimes on silver, depending on the wealth and complexity or otherwise of the meal. Small tables made trades essential even in humble houses. Before this date, the courses were placed on the three-legged tables and carried into the banqueters, hence the expression first tables for the first course and second tables for the second. A restaurant would no doubt have followed the same pattern of serving as at the private house. As we said, wealthy households owned cooks as slaves, and Martial remarked that a cook must possess the same tastes as his master. Generally, a good cook, if you want to hire one, was expensive. Big households or restaurants or more complex living places had meals in the shape of an hourglass, turned by blindfold donkeys, and the remains of bakeries have been found at various ancient sites. In Pompeii alone, there were something like 30 bakeries. Fuel wasn't cheap, so bakers cooked in one large pots, loaves, sometimes made by their customers, sometimes made by the bakers themselves. Just as I've been describing the house kitchens, similar were the kitchens of restaurants and places to eat outside, because not everyone ate at home, obviously, especially in the urban centers, as we said earlier on. There were places in the cities of the Roman Empire where either a full meal or a snack could be eaten. The fast food establishments of the day were called popinai and served fried fish and ham as well, sausages and other delicacies. So popinai was the restaurant of the day, it was a tavern of the day, and as such, they also had a reputation as the haunt of drunks, thieves and prostitutes, and lazy slaves. Juvenal describes in passing an all-night popina where debauched insomniacs would fritter away the small hours. This literary evidence comes from an upper-class perspective, however, and the greasy restaurants, as Horace called them, were probably enjoyed by a large part of the population. As we've seen, nothing much changes sometimes. The upper classes ridiculing the enjoyment of the lower classes. Juvenal made fun also of the old men who still happened to frequent the all-night bars at Rome's harbour town Ostia, as if they were still youngsters. The Phoenician host, greasy with respectful hair oil, runs to welcome his guest's approach and calls him master, why not king? Here the waitress, running to him with her skirt hitched up, already uncorking a bottle. Send to Ostia for him, Caesar. Look in the big tavern there. You'll find him lying alongside some brawler, in among sailors and thieves and runaways, with hangmen and coffin makers and the sodden priest of Cybele. His symbols strangely silent. In the tavern, all are equally free, all drink from a common cup. The couch is barred to no man, the table is no closer to one than is to another. The philosopher Seneca complains about what he has to listen to just outside his apartment's window. Pancake sellers and the sausage vendor and the confectioner and all the proprietors of restaurants selling their wares with miscellaneous shouts, each in his distinctive accent. Similar to the popina was the thermopolium, or hot food place. A well-known thermopolium, Asselina's thermopolium, had an assortment of amphorae and jugs for serving hot and cold drinks. There were also cozy corners and upper rooms which bear out the suggestion made by certain writers that bars and fast food restaurants were used for purposes other than eating. In Pompeii, at the inn near the corner of Mercury Street, the walls are decorated with paintings depicting people seated around tables with sausages, strings of onions and cheeses hanging from the rafters. Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, writes of ham covered in soot from the fire, hanging in the hovel of a poor elderly couple, while Virgil has a round cheese pierced through the middle with a string and a bunch of dried dill hanging in the hut of his peasant Simulus. Tenant farmers like him had been regarded from the earliest times as the backbone of the Roman state. The distinction between what was and what was not luxurious is vital for our understanding of food in antiquity. The ancient world lived for the most part at subsistence level, as did almost all societies until the modern age. Food shortages were frequent, and doctors didn't find anything strange in recording what poor people ate and suffered during a time of want. Normally the people in the country would be starved after a poor harvest, while city dwellers were cushioned by grain stored in government granaries or in private hands. For during the imperial period, the tax collector and landlord extracted the due from the peasantry with ruthless efficiency. The basic ingredients of any Roman meal seems to be olive oil and wine. That was probably on every corner of the Mediterranean, and it's the cornerstone of the modern Mediterranean diet as well. Regional styles existed, certainly, and this took up the native cuisine which existed prior to the Roman conquest, and also adapted Roman recipes to locally available ingredients. So, we have examples in Britain and Germany of long halls in some villas which attest to the survival of Celtic feasting around meat roasted on a spit. And in northern Gaul, butter and cream were incorporated to Roman dishes. As we said, there was meat served in all the different fast food places, but meat generally was expensive. One of the main strands of satirical humor in Petronius is the serving of meat at every course in Trimalchio's banquet, for this would have appeared vulgar even to a wealthy senator. So the three-course meal, as we said, all in the first tables they would have meat course. The appetizers would be all these different little snacks, and the desserts will be fruits and nuts and sweets. So yeah, the juxtaposition that Petronius is making. We think that pork was the most popular meat in ancient Rome, and from records we have like in 301 CE, we have the Emperor Diocletian publishing a decree on maximum prices. He was trying to stop inflation, to curb inflation, and so from that decree we have some idea what people were getting paid and how much food stuff costs. So we know, for example, that 12 denarii would buy a pound of pork or venison or the best quality fresh fish, while the same sum could purchase nearly 3 pounds of beans or barley. A farm labourer could expect to earn 25 denarii as a daily wage, a baker 50 denarii, and an interior decorator of 75 denarii. Rome, as a massive city, as the capital, must have had hundreds, if not thousands, of bakers and street food sellers and taverns and popinae. And the Emperor Trajan, in the 2nd century AD, built a huge shopping complex in Rome. On the 5th floor of this were special facilities for selling fish, and 2 channels were built specifically to provide the water in which the fish were kept. One linked to fresh water aqueduct, and the other to supply of salt water from Ostia. Ostia was the port town of ancient Rome. At Ostia itself, water tanks and marble slabs have been unearthed from the premises of fishmongers. So it seems the concentration of wealth in large cities allowed for a thriving fish market. Despite all the similarities of the ancient Roman cooking with today's cooking, most of the ancient cooking methods are cumbersome for anyone without an army of kitchen slaves. We have to be clear about that. Everything was made from scratch. There was lots of pounding, a lot of sauces, a lot of fetching waters, making fires, making sure the correct temperatures, all these elaborate dishes, different utensils, and so on and so on and so on. Basically, there was no shortcuts, no Marks and Spencer and Waitrose to go and get some ready-made meals. The kitchens of wealthy households had a solid built-in stove made of cement or clay, which called focus. A caminus was a stove with a chimney above it. The stove consisted of a square structure between 1.10 meters and 1.30 meters high and about 1.20 meters deep. They varied in length, and wood or charcoal stored in a shed were burned on the focus on a barbecue-like fashion. Unlike barbecue, however, no grill was placed above the embers. Instead, each pan was placed on the flames on an individual tripod. Grills, called retiacula, were generally no larger than 25 centimeters square. They had handles and little feet, so that they could be placed above the hot coals. The focus was large enough for different kinds of fire: licking flames, glowing coals, and hot ashes. Fierce flames were for searing the meat, which was exposed to the side of the flame, and for roasting whole animals and hams on a spit. Again, to the side of the flame, and never above it. Fierce flames heated cold liquids quickly and were necessary for stir-frying, for quickly frying stuff. Many kitchens had an oven called furnus, and sometimes called fornax. Some, like the kitchen in the Villa de Misteri in Pompeii, had 2 such ovens. The oven consisted of a square or dome-shaped hollow construction of brick or stone with a flat floor, often made of granite, sometimes lava. It was filled with dry twigs, then lit. When the fire was spent, the glowing embers were swept aside. The first heat of the glowing oven was suitable for baking unleavened or thin breads. So then, after them, the large round loaves go in. Then, when that's finished, meat dishes go in and the door is closed. After an hour or so, these are removed, but the oven is still hot, so finer pastries follow, and then dishes that require the least heat. From Pompeii, we have a wealthy woman and entrepreneur called Julia Felix. Her restaurant, which had a grab-and-go place and the eat-in area. This had tables and upright benches, perhaps with cushions. And next to it, we have a kitchen with all the above utensils and elements and stoves. Now I wanted to tell you some ancient fast food to grab and go. Some recipes and some dishes that are suitable for these thermopolia or fast food joints, and that would make a delicious starter for your courses. One of these is smoked fish in vine leaves, thrion tarichus, with smoked fish seasoned with fish sauce and cheese and wrapped in fig leaf and baked. Of course, another one is ordinary thrion, which again stuffed fig leaf. Apparently makes the most delicious food according to Didymus, an ancient commentator from one of Aristophanes' comedies. Of course, this recipe is for stuffed leaves. It's the precursor of the modern Greek and Turkish dolmades. And they did use fig leaves, not vine leaves, to be honest. I think it's difficult to find fresh, young, tender fig leaves. But if you can, try it, because I think it has a very different taste. So the ordinary thrion was made with pig or kid lard, flour, milk, and the yolk of an egg to bind it. Of course, you could use fig leaves to wrap the mixture and cook it in there, and then basically use it as a flavoring for the filling. So don't eat the wrapped leaf. Another dish would be pork in sweet wine and a fig sauce. So if you get about a kilo of pork, cut into small pieces, fry them in a casserole with a little olive oil until it's brown. Get a couple of teaspoons of coriander seeds, toast them, and then grind them. Toast the pork in salt, white wine vinegar, and coriander. Chop the figs. Take 5 dried figs, chop them, and boil them in a couple of glasses of water for 5 minutes. Strain the resulting fig stock and reserve. The dried figs after that can be a bit gritty, so discard them. Add the wine, like a liter of sweet wine, oregano, some more white wine vinegar, like 3 tablespoons, and the fig stock to the pork. Cook the casserole for an hour or an hour and a half in a preheated oven around 180 degrees Celsius. And then just before you serve, sprinkle some chopped parsley and serve with bread or pearl barley to accompany the dish. Another recipe would be served with breads or flatbreads, would be the herb puree with pine kernels, like a precursor to the modern pesto, but not with basil. The ancient Romans didn't use basil for food, if used, mostly found in medicine. So yeah, get 100 grams of pine kernels, or hazelnuts for that matter, like 2 or 3 big handfuls of fresh parsley, 80 milliliters of olive oil, 80 milliliters of red wine vinegar, couple of teaspoons of ground black pepper, 125 grams of some tangy, crumbly cheese, like feta or ricotta salata or pecorino romano perhaps, a handful of fresh coriander leaves if you like them, a few mint leaves, a sprig of savory or thyme, and some sea salt. And basically, grind all that together. Probably, most likely nowadays you'll use a food processor, not by hand. And and then you have your herb puree to serve with hot, crusty bread. And for the Patreon backers only, I've got an exclusive recipe for Cucurbita's more Alexandrino, or an Alexandrian bottle gourd or squash recipe, which is the calabash, since the ancient Romans didn't have any pumpkins and squashes. This came from Americas. So the recipe from Apicius goes like this. Enjoy! And that's it. That's the episode for today. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this. I've been Thomas Dinas, and this was the Delicious Legacy Podcast. See you soon for another archeogastronomical adventure. Bye!
Audiet pugnas vitio parentum, rara juventus.